Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to the second public lecture in our series of lectures organized on the philosophy of David Graeber. The philosopher we are going to talk about tonight is Roy Bhaskar, to whom David Graeber, remember the tweet, gave a top score, same score as Spinoza, we discussed last month. But unlike Spinoza, David Graeber knew Bhaskar personally, and they even entertained the idea of writing a book together. And the fact that I will never be able to read that book is probably one of my biggest regrets, really. To talk about Roy Bhaskar, we are pleased to welcome tonight Frederic Vandenberghe and Douglas Porpora. Hello, Douglas.
Hi.
So you are a professor of sociology at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Among the several books you published, there is one that is of particular interest for us today, which is Reconstructing Sociology, the Critical Realist Approach, published in Cambridge University Press. Frederic is a professor of sociology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Hello, Frederic. So you were a colleague of David Graeber at Yale, and you are a member of the MOS group in France, a group that David Graeber was also a member of. You have edited what I think is, but correct me if I'm wrong, the only translation of Roy Bhaskar into French, and I'm personally grateful for that. You also published in English this time what's critical about critical realism. So you both have tried to, following Margaret Archer and others, to use critical realism in your sociology, which we really find at the Museum of Care a fascinating perspective. So tonight you will be talking about critical realism and baseline communism in what you called a heavenly conversation between Roy Bhaskar and David Graeber. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Vasily, and also thanks to Nika. Well, I think by now Roy Bhaskar and David Graeber have been joined by Eric Olin Wright as well, who passed away, and his Real Utopia project in a really dystopian world, I think, is now continuing up there in heaven. Thanks for having us. Really, when you invited me, I thought it would be really good to have Doug as well, because, well, he has worked a lot with critical realism, and also he has the necessary political credentials on the left that make him the right person to be here. The nice thing of coming here, of being here, is in fact to have discovered the Anti-Institute and also the Museum of Care, which presents itself as the real Ministry of Defense, indeed, defense and care, that kind of goes together. So that was a very, very nice discovery. And what I have decided with Doug, in fact, is instead of having two talks of 20 minutes, we'll do a double act and we will alternate. And we have foreseen three parts. The first part will be about critical realism. I will start with going through the career of Roy Bhaskar, his different books, his politics, and then I will pass it over to Doug, who will flesh it out in more technical terms. That will be the first part. We think we can do it in 7 minutes each. Then the second part will be about this encounter between Graeber and Bhaskar, where I will look, in fact, at David's interesting take on critical realism, but somewhat surprising for me. And Doug will take over by looking at a text, an exchange, in fact, a polemic between Viveros de Castro and David, and there he will see what critical realism can do when it takes on the ontological turn in anthropology. Then, if we have time at the end, I will, in fact, how would I say, bring in Marcel Mauss. I mean, I know he's not on your famous list, but I really wonder why, in the sense that, I mean, Marcel Mauss is in all his books, whereas Bhaskar is only in some books. And Doug, that is, if we still have time, but I'll certainly give him the time, will talk about, not about Mauss, but about Marx, and from a critical realist perspective. Is that okay, Doug?
Yeah.
Sure. So then I'll go just the presentation of Roy Bhaskar, who was actually a very interesting figure, Anglo-Indian, who started in Oxford as an economy student, and he came to the conclusion that standard economics had absolutely nothing to say about the real world. It was all about economic models, analytical models. And so from there, together with his supervisor, Ram Hare, he started writing an enormous PhD on, the philosophy of the social sciences. This PhD was very, very encompassing. It was really a major work where he laid out the foundations of critical realism, which is basically, how would I say, a Marxist attempt, as it were, to think through, all the presuppositions of philosophy, of the philosophy of science. And his basic idea, which Dirk will explain much later, will be that it's a radical critique of positivism. Basically saying, well, science is not really about finding correlations between dependent and independent variables, but it is about finding generative mechanisms. And then he went into a whole philosophical development to show what science really is about. And his PhD, already in the PhD as well, he was in fact defending a nationalist, scientific, anti-positivist model, and then he would explore, the possibilities of using that model in the social sciences, which is critical naturalism. In fact, the term itself, critical realism, is a contraction of transcendental realism and critical naturalism in the social science, so that became the denomination. Then he also had a long section on ideology critique. But what happened, in fact, is that Roy Bhaskar's PhD never passed, so he never got his PhD, because the dons in Oxford thought that there was nothing new in it. And what happened, in fact, is that Bhaskar published a first book in 1975, a really realist theory of science, which laid the groundwork exactly of the whole movement in philosophy, which is called critical realism. And then, I mean, the second book, 3 years later in 78, was the possibility of naturalism. And from then onwards, a whole spate, in fact, of books on philosophy of science, natural sciences, and the social sciences. And this work was, in fact, not very much read by philosophers, but it was taken up by social scientists and social theorists in sociology, in geography, in other areas. And all that was very, very exciting. That was the time when Giddens was also publishing his structuration theory. And for social theorists, I mean, this was very, very, very exciting. That was the first phase. What happened then later is that Bhaskar, who was a difficult writer, I mean, his texts are very dense, he started to try to develop a dialectical system of thought, which he called dialectical critical realism. I must say at this time, which was in the 80s, 90s, I started to disconnect, because his writing became very, very elusive with lots of neologisms. And it was really, how would I say, an elaborate system. And it was pretty difficult to follow, because you had also lots of diagrams, and it was a bit like the late verse. I mean, lots of ideas, but very, very elaborate, and in fact, very, very elusive. Dialectic, the pulse of freedom. And a lot of people were kind of taking back. I mean, kind of the erstwhile realists were thinking that this was not exactly what they had been waiting for. And then around the turn of the millennium, the situation became, in fact, even more complicated because Roy Bhaskar had a spiritual turn. Spiritual turn in the sense that he developed, he was basically trying to bring together, I would say, the new left with new age. And this was very, very difficult because the people who had been critical realists were kind of Marxist to start with. And then when he went into the dialectics, they could still follow. But then when he brought back the Buddha nature of human beings, I mean, then a lot of people were dismayed. And I mean, this association between critical realism and a sect comes, in fact, from there. Also because, for instance, Margaret Archer also has a strong interest in religion, linked, in fact, more to Catholicism. So those things were coming together, but I would say that what we find in critical realism as a movement is, on the one hand, very serious philosophy, and then at the same time, somehow with a soft underbelly, which has to do with moral issues, which has to do with politics, because one of the things that you certainly found in Bhaskar was always the support of alternative critical and radical movements. Bhaskar himself was always at the margin of the university. When you would see him, and towards the end of his life, he would be sitting in a wheelchair. I mean, he was kind of a very sweet, heterodox, unorthodox, unconventional thinker. And when I met him, that was indeed the connection I had kind of also via Indian philosophy. And I think what is interesting, and what I will say in the second part, is that I was surprised, in fact, when I saw what David did with Bhaskar, that he was, in fact, less interested, I would say, in the first phase, but much more in the dialectical phase and even the spiritual phase, which was for me a surprise. But now I pass the floor to Doug, who will explain in a couple of words basically the main tenets of critical realism. So please hold on. It will be a little bit more technical, but also so much more interesting. Please, Doug.
Thanks, Frederic. Yeah, so I'm really going to be talking about what Frederic described as the first phase critical realism in this section. There's just too much to go on the others. The first thing I want to say is that critical realism wasn't just the brainchild of Roy Bhaskar. There's a whole progressive community out of which this came. One major thrust of that effort was the critique of causal laws that we get from positivism, the so-called covering law model of causal explanation, which has people looking statistically for statistical laws. And critical realism contested that. As Frederic said, that's not really what attracted David Graeber. He was more concerned with the Heraclitean move that Bhaskar later makes, but also fundamentally, even from the first phase, with critical realism's realism. And that connects with this exchange between Eduardo Viveiros de Castro and David Graeber that I'm going to talk about later. That exchange is a good connection to critical realism because the exchange begins with Viveiros de Castro commenting that David, a political anarchist, seems unable to accept that in the absence of a transcendental point of view, we're left with ontological anarchy or relativism about the nature of reality. So by ontological anarchy, that's kind of ontological relativism. That's kind of a position that harkens back, if you remember, to the structure of scientific revolutions, where Kuhn talks about how scientists operating in different paradigms, it's almost like they inhabit different worlds. Kuhn didn't mean that literally, but the proponents, the anthropological proponents of the ontological turn, seeing different cultures as almost different worlds, do at least pretend that they mean this literally. So Viveiros de Castro suggests that without a transcendental point of view, we're left with an unresolvable ontological relativism. We critical realists disagree. Bhaskar coined this term epistemic fallacy, to describe a perspective where epistemology completely swallows up ontology. And despite its name, with its post-structural roots, the ontological turn partakes of that fallacy. From the beginning, critical realism situated itself between positivism and post-structuralism, really postmodernism, but it's really kind of post-structuralism. And critical realism considers the post-structuralists and the positivists to be evil twins. Why? Because both, abjuring any kind of ontologically objective reality, adhere to an entirely epistemic account of truth. By an epistemic account of truth, I mean they equate truth either with some epistemic state like certainty or consensus, or with some foundationalist protocol or method that secures certainty or consensus. So on the one hand, believing in foundationalism, positivism believes that certainty is possible and therefore truth. Disbelieving in foundationalism, post-structuralism disbelieves in both certainty and hence also truth. So critical realism differs from the evil twins on two counts. First, critical realism rejects foundationalism, that there's some kind of road to truth, that if you have some methodology, the truth will pop out like an axiom. But second, it also rejects this whole epistemic account of truth in favor of an account of truth that's more ontological in nature. And that brings me to the three premises of critical realism that Bhaskar called the Holy Trinity. Despite being a realist, as Frederic said, he kind of liked religious terminology. So the first premise of critical realism is ontological realism, that there exists an ontologically objective reality independent of our minds. The second premise is epistemic relativism, the realization, which is just the realization that we all approach knowledge from different standpoints with different criteria of validation. If we stop at this premise, we just throw up our hands to ask, well, who's to say, and become cognitive and moral relativists. And that is where post-structuralism and social constructionism tend to stop. But critical realism offers a third premise, which it terms judgmental rationality. Judgmental rationality means that despite epistemic relativism, despite our all coming from different places and having different criteria, we could still make valid truth determinations. Let me go back to the point of that critical realist understanding of truth is ontological rather than epistemic. On the critical realist account, truth does not depend on our certainty or our method of arriving at it. Instead, regardless of our level of certainty, we have the truth if what we believe or what we say matches how the world actually is. It matches that ontologically objective reality. How do we know how the world actually is? Well, in simple cases, we know by simple inspection. You think, you're not certain, but you think you left your keys in the car. You go and you look and you find the keys. I mean, it's a very simple kind of confirmation. But even in more difficult cases, the difficult cases that generally interest us, we can discern the truth without any kind of foundations. How? By engaging in ad hoc argument with each other, just as a jury does. It doesn't take any foundational method to see that of the available arguments, some are stronger than others. The strongest argument offers our best guess at the truth. That's really the premise of judgmental rationality. Even then, critical realism suggests a difference between any truth determination we make and the objective or actual truth. They're not the same. Thus, our truth determinations can go wrong. Critical realism adopts a fallibilist understanding of truth, meaning that one must always be open to new arguments and new evidence, as when a jury conviction is confronted with new DNA evidence suggesting innocence. According to critical realism, it's only the truth judgment that changes, not the actual or objective truth itself. Just as the actual solar system did not change when we moved from a geocentric to a heliocentric view. Our worldviews, in other words, should not be collapsed with the world itself. I'll say one more thing about this point. It sounds like I'm saying that instead of any foundational method, the critical realist road to truth I'm describing is rhetoric conducted on a case-by-case basis, something akin to the methodological anarchy of Paul Feyerabend. Now, the post-structuralists would also say the truth is determined by rhetoric. There's a difference, however, between how we think of rhetoric, how we think rhetoric functions, and how they think rhetoric functions. The post-structuralists, the social constructionists, when they talk about rhetoric, they adopt the Greek sophist view of rhetoric, where rhetoric actually creates the truth. Critical realists, in contrast, follow an Aristotelian view of rhetoric, where rhetoric doesn't create the truth, but simply the best way to discern the truth in contexts outside of mathematics where formal proofs don't apply. So that really is, there's a lot more to critical realism, as they say, having to do with its notions of causality. But those are the three, in a nutshell, those are the three holy trinity of critical realism and the realism that David Graeber, we'll see when I come back, really picks up on. Okay.
Thank you, Doc. Last time I saw David Bhaskar, David Graeber and Roy Bhaskar together was at the annual conference of the International Association of Critical Realism in the summer of 2014. The next thing I saw from David was a beautiful obituary of Roy Bhaskar he had published in The Guardian. When to prepare for this event today, I went through some of David's text. I was surprised because critical realism usually it gives a kind of a solid ontological foundation for more structuralist Marxist approaches, sure, with a praxeological inflection, with a more structuralist approach, in fact, to structures, big social structures of domination like capitalism, patriarchy, or colonialism, by saying that what we have to think about is to think those systems, in fact, and those structures in terms of generative mechanisms, or as I call them sometimes, degenerative mechanisms. That is, in fact, structures that impose that are real, even if, we cannot exactly touch them by the finger. They are transfactual, but we can, analyze their effects in real life. When I saw David's text, I saw that for him, critical realism is all about power, causal power, potentiality, and creativity. And that was, in fact, a big surprise for me, because that's not what I expected. So, for instance, when towards an anthropological theory of value, he mentions critical realism, he starts, in fact, not by going back to the classical works of the first wave, the first period, but he starts with an argument that opposes Parmenides and Plato to Heraclitus, Hegel. And this is really, really surprising, because that is exactly the work that comes from Plato, etc., that comes from dialectics, which is, in fact, the work which is the most difficult to digest. And then, as I already said before as well, this philosophy of meta-reality, which is a new age approach to being. If critical realism is all about thinking being, what you have with the philosophy of meta-reality, it's about being. And that's also something that crops up then in David's writing on Bhaskar. That's strange. So when he says in his anthropological theory of value that he goes along with Bhaskar, he mentions 5 points. First one is realism, but he does it in his typical unconventional way. What does it basically mean? That he distinguishes the 2 planes, one of ontology, which is kind of has to be presupposed to exist independent of our theories, And then precisely the theories, which is the epistemology, the ways of looking at things, which there can be historically viable. And what he takes on board is what Bhaskar calls the epistemic fallacy, which is that you cannot, that you have to presuppose, as Doc explained, that reality is independent from our conceptions of it, certainly when we are thinking about the natural sciences. So that's why you can combine, in fact, ontological realism with epistemological pluralism. That goes together. The second point then would be the powers approach, which is indeed an Aristotelian approach. And he takes on the stratification of reality, which is the distinction between the real, the actual, and the empirical. I won't go into that. David reinterprets that it's all about power, it's all about potentiality, it's all about becoming, which again is a reading which you find in the dialectical period, but which you don't, you find it if you really look for it in the first period, but that is what David latches onto. Then there's a whole argument which in the Bhaskar's work has to do with emergence. That is basically different levels of complexity, when you move from chemistry to biology to sociology and so on and so on. It's about emergence or supervenience, as it's called in analytical philosophy. And David interprets that as a philosophy of freedom that is already in nature. And again, that's kind of a surprising reading. Then it is about open systems. Because one of the big arguments of Bhaskar is that when you look at scientific experiments, this is basically in controlled circumstances, but in the lab, closing the system. Whereas in real life, what we have is in fact open systems, where you have different generative mechanisms operating at the same time, with the result, in fact, that nothing is predictable. It's like the weather, different things coming in, or it's like the war in Ukraine. Nobody knows how this is going to end. Of course, we all know that it's going to end badly. Yeah. But the other things is then he links that to tendencies and creativity, discourse of powers. And again, it's very, very strange because he uses critical realism, not to defend kind of the more structural aspects of reality, but in fact to defend an ontology of practices. Where he links that to creative action. A conclusion, which I get there, is in the conclusion of the book: creative potential is everything. It is the ultimate social reality. Again, he invokes critical realism with a very strong tonality, or let's say reference, as it were, but not quoted to the ultimate phase, to do dialectical things. So I was surprised. Because when I looked at social creativity, and here I'm thinking about another article by him on fetishism and social creativity, what he has is a world in which the world, a view of the world, in which the world is wobbly. It's kind of made and unmade, nothing is stable. It's all flux, constant creativity, in which few arrangements are fixed and permanent. So what you have is basically a world, which is in fact the world which we find in in Castoriadis. It is also the world, the ontology we find in Negri, whereas in fact everything is just kind of bursting, everything is open, and there's always perspective for newness, bringing something new into the world. In Enlightened Common Sense, which is a book which was by Roy Bhaskar, which was published after his death, and which is called Enlightened Common Sense, there is a blurb by David, and I'm going to read this blurb. But before that, when I looked at your webpage, one of the quotations which you have by David is: revolution happens when there is transformation of common sense. This is really surprising because nobody really understood the title Enlightened Common Sense. It was a strange title. And here we have it taken up by David. And what does he say in the blurb? Again, a little bit of projection, but also, of course, lots of compliments. Roy Bhaskar's too brief life was a gift to humanity. The gift is something I will pick up later because the hidden figure, Morse, is absolutely central to understand his whole work. His life's work gave us a solid ontological grounding for all those intuitions that most of us feel we should be able to justify, but are constantly being told by the reigning intellectual authorities we can't, that the world and other people are real. That's fine. That is indeed, as Doug explained, but then immediately goes further, that freedom is inherent in the nature of the cosmos, which is a very speculative element, that genuine human flourishing can never be at the expense of others. Of course, I mean, that was also Bhaskar's line, because Bhaskar was also a socialist. So he was saying that, almost a Buddhist argument at the end as well, that, suffering will only be overcome when nobody is suffering, which basically means that you have to revolutionize the system. Bhaskar lived to provide the intellectual heavy artillery for simple common decency and good sense. His heavy artillery is also strange because when you go to his book on the anthropology of value, which has a very Mosian subtitle, and I have it here somewhere, which is The False Coin of Our Dreams. That's a quotation of Mos. And when he opens his chapter on Mos, there is a quotation there where he's also quoting the heavy artillery, where in fact the gift and the communist, if you want, economy are underneath of the capitalist economy. So it's strange. Then, much of his work was written in exceedingly difficult language, which cannot be said of David, who has exactly this kind of, I would say, popular approach and popularizing approach. And in fact, that's what you can feel. This kind of good sense. This is kind of his, I think, his working class background, which makes him insist on this. But much of the work by Bhaskar was written in exceedingly difficult language. This book, however, makes it accessible to those who have the most to gain from it. Anyone trying to make the world a better place. So what I can say is that the critical realism is there. It is, in fact, mostly an association with, indeed, the more romantic side of Roy Bhaskar, the political side of Bhaskar. And in fact, it's very, very, very surprising because that is not exactly what I expected when I started looking. I thought it would be more structural, but no, it is an ontology of potentials. And in fact, why not? Why not? So I now pass on to Doug again, and you're going to tell us something about critical realism and Marx. Is that correct?
Do you want me to skip the exchange?
Oh, no. Sorry. Please go ahead. That's you want to talk about the ontological turn in anthropology. Correct.
Let me just say that everything that I mirror Frederic's surprise about the non-structural, David's neglect of the more structural elements in critical realism. I think it's for two reasons. One is that the practice turn from Sherry Ortner is very strong in anthropology. And two, I think he knew Bhaskar more than the rest of the political realists. And so you don't get that heavy structural analysis in Bhaskar himself. But let me turn to this exchange with Viveiros de Castro. So as I said, Viveiros de Castro accuses David of not accepting the ontological turn. And in a piece called Who's Afraid of the Ontological Wolf, Viveiros de Castro seizes on a passage David wrote in an article published in the journal Anthropological Theory. In the passage, David says something which seems rather innocent. He says, it would be going too far, this is David saying, it would be going too far to say that certain Malagasy charms actually work. Like one charm that really can tie someone's intestines into knots, or another prevent hail from falling on anyone's crops. As I say, it seems, that's the remark. It seems rather innocent. Viveiros de Castro, however, likens Graeber's remark to one by Evans Pritchard long ago, to the effect that witches, as the Zandis conceive them, cannot exist. Viveiros de Castro goes on to say, and Viveiros de Castro writes in this very convoluted style compared to this working class style that the difference in their styles is really striking too. Viveiros goes on to say, quote, I'm going to quote, then I'm going to simplify it. The ontological turn is nothing more than a change in the disciplinary language that forbids by declaring an illegal move such an analytical facility on the anthropologist's part. In the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat that again. Well, I'll repeat it. The ontological turn is nothing more than a change in the disciplinary language that forbids by declaring it an illegal move an analytical facility on the anthropologist's part. What's he talking about? What's the illegal move? It seems anyone saying that anyone else's ontology is wrong. Well, that makes sense. If there's no truth or no ontologically objective reality, how can anyone's professed ontology be mistaken? Instead of reality itself, the ontological turn leaves us only with what people say is real. But is that really where we want to go? It sounds like having to accept the alternative facts and reality of the Trump administration. And David's response, to Viveiros de Castro, which he dedicates to Roy Bhaskar, David notes that the ontological turn, this is David now speaking, the ontological turn seems to deprive us of any ability to challenge the reigning falsities of even our own society. The proponents of the ontological turn deny wanting to go that far, but unless they do, it's not clear they're saying anything. About this predicament, David comments, and then here's to get a quote. I sometimes think of social theory as a kind of game, where one of the prizes is to see who can come up with the wildest, most shocking, most dangerous sounding idea that still does not offer any meaningful challenge to existing structures of authority. That charge does seem to apply to the ontological turn. The ontological turn effectively collapses what people say is their ontology with what's actually the case. Without critical realism's premise of ontological realism, that's where you end up with social construction and post-structuralism. Let me just say a couple more things. The putative ontological anarchy of the turn is actually self-refuting. Ontological anarchy, after all, is in itself a unitary ontological premise. So if ontological anarchy actually prevails, that anarchy represents one comprehensive monistic ontology. Graeber makes the same observation, saying, and again I'm quoting, despite protestations to the contrary, the ontological turn does not abandon traditional philosophical quest for a universal ontology, but rather proposes its own tacit ontology, which is essentially a form of philosophical idealism. So again, ontological anarchy is itself a comprehensive ontology, refuting the claim of multiple ontologies. Ontology is ineluctably singular, so you can't claim it's not singular without contradiction. And what they offer instead is where our rhetoric creates reality is philosophical idealism, which is what David was saying. So as Frederic said, Roy once referred to critical realism as enlightened common sense. And it's essentially that enlightened common sense that David is defending against a portentous and pretentious high academic theory. That's it. Back to you.
That's correct. Thank you. Well, now we are entering the last section, and I'll be very, very short, just to give also what the opportunity to say something about Marx and critical realism. I was surprised, in fact, that in the list of the hit parade of greatest thinkers, Marcel Mauss was not present, because Marcel Mauss is absolutely central to all the books that David has written. So Bhaskar, you find them here and there. In fact, I only found them towards an anthropological theory of value. Also in his small prickly pear pamphlet on anarchist anthropology, but although and in some papers, in fact, academic articles which you find in the paper section on the webpage of the institute. But why is Marcel Mauss so important? Because Bhaskar, in the last stage of his life, he was talking about the ground state of being, which is basically, for those of you who have been to India or to Japan, is when you're in this kind of state where everything is connected and you're in your element, where love and generosity is freely flowing. And this idea of being in a community where everything is freely flowing, where you have, and here the importance, in fact, of Marshall Salin's interpretations of the gift, the essay on the gift by Marcel Mauss, where he stresses the importance of generalized reciprocity, where basically, you know, when you give something to a friend, although in anthropology, it's most of the time exchanges or gifts between communities. And in fact, what you have is that, you know, it's just a generalized interdependency, a generalized reciprocity. And he sees in that a form of communism. A form of communism because you find there the famous words of Marx in the Gotha program, which is from each according to their abilities and to each according to their necessities. And what is interested is precisely this situation of open-ended obligation. Someone has given something to you, and you can always call back on them for other situations. It's a generalized interdependency and reciprocity and generosity. And for David, when he kind of asks a transcendental question, how is society possible? Well, he's saying, in fact, society, social life is possible precisely because you have this kind of social ground state, because this kind of primitive communism is what sustains social life as such. So underneath of the formal capitalist economy, or even underneath of state bureaucracies, what you have is, in fact, this generalized reciprocity, which is based on the gift, which is something which he recognized in Marcel Mauss. Marcel Mauss, who was the nephew of Durkheim, but who was also an activist and very much fending for forms of associative democracy and socialist cooperatives. And how that, how they say, gels with Marxism, that is what Doug will tell us when he closes off here our discussion. Doug, if you could do it relatively quickly so that we have time for Q&A.
I'm going to abbreviate my remarks. So I said that critical realism was born of a whole community of progressive scholars, many of whom were Marxists. The current president of the International Association of Critical Realism is a Marxist. My own view is that critical realism can almost be understood as the philosophy of science underlying Marx's method. What I'm not going to go into is the critique of positivism, which leads us to understanding causal analysis in terms of equations. Critical realism supports a much more, it doesn't dispense with statistics, but it reduces statistics from explanation to a sort of evidence and really opens things up for more qualitative approaches like ethnography and historical narrative, which is, of course, characteristic of historical materialism. Aside from that, critical realism is materialist. It's ontologically and epistemically materialist. It's ontologically materialist, and this says, you know, what is precedes our consciousness of it. There is a world out there independent of our consciousness, independent of our ideologies. So that's one thing. It's ontologically materialist, but it's also epistemically materialist, critical realism, that we can know this reality. It's not just a matter of there's a reality out there, but we can't know anything about it. So it breaks with the kind of Kantian approach, again, of post-structuralism and a lot of social constructionism and social constructionism. And let me just say this, and I'll end with this. There's another part that actually is dear to my heart. I almost forgot. Critical realism, and it goes back to what Frederic was talking about, really makes a case for a structural level of analysis that is completely missed by those who think that all there is discourse. If you think of inequality, conflicts of interest, or competition, that's not a behavior, but the conflict of interest that creates the competition, What is that? Inequality is not a practice. Inequality is not a discourse. It's a relation. And it's a relation that can exist whether anybody knows about it or not. And that's left out of the discursive approaches. And it's there in Marx. It's actually there in Bourdieu too, if it's not an Americanized Bourdieu. Bourdieu himself was very clear that there were structural relations in what he called the field that were not the same as interactions. So those are the various ways in which I think the critical realism is supportive as a meta theory or a philosophy of science of a Marxian approach. And I'll just say this: if you're an activist and if you're critical, I think you need a concept of truth. It can't just be that it's your idea that such and such group, men, women, people of color are oppressed. It's got to be true that this is the case. Otherwise, you have really nothing to say to people who don't agree with you. If it's all just our point of view, if it's all just subjective, then anybody's subjective point of view is as good as anybody else. So I think that, particularly now, coming from the United States, where the right has really seized on post-truth, I think it's a real problem. But the left was there first, I have to say. The cultural left was there first. So I will end there.
Thank you so much, Frederic and Douglas, for your presentation. I will put the references that you cited on the website, because I think many people asked in the chat. Avi.
I just want to say thank you very much, Frederic and Doug, because the first question I have, or maybe I'll leave the second question for later, is something that I've wanted to ask experts in critical realism for a long time. So I get the general gist of the points basically through reading Graeber's stuff on critical realism, right? But I haven't read anything from Bhaskar himself, so maybe that's why I don't get this point. But when there is this emphasis on an independence between ontology, or what is out there, versus how I know about it, maybe it's just a word problem. But in a lot of work that I do, which is to do with how people shape the environment in agriculture and so on and so forth, or in public health and coronavirus and all of that, then let's say you have a partial idea, a partial truth about ontology that you know through various means, perhaps we can call them common sense or whatever they might be. But then that does then reshape the actual landscape in which the person is living. So maybe I'm just getting stuck on the word independent. So could you just help me clarify that the fact that there is a feedback between those two, or how to make sense of that? Does that make sense, my question?
Very good. You want to answer, Doug?
Sure. So we operate on our truth determinations. So the world we think we live in consists of the world made up of what we ourselves have determined true, even if it's counter to what the society as a whole thinks. So it's true that the world you think you live in is made up of your truth determinations. But critical realism is fallibilistic again, and makes the distinction between the world you think you live in and the actual world. Now, I think that most of us, well, I personally would accept what Donald Davidson once said, the British analytical philosopher Donald Davidson once said: most of our beliefs have to be kind of true. Otherwise, we couldn't function. You know, I believe there are a lot of them are trivial beliefs, like I see a door in front of me, or I know where the door is, I can go out it. We couldn't function unless most of our beliefs are true. That doesn't mean most of our important beliefs are true. But in many cases, the world we think we live in is, in fact, a common world that everybody thinks they live in. And it's the cases where we disagree are more, I guess, isolated, I would say. They might be very important. They might be, I mean, I believe Donald Trump exists, so we don't have a quarrel about whether he exists or not. And he doesn't know that I exist, but there's a lot of things we don't dispute. Whether the election, his election was stolen, that's a big issue in the United States right now. But that doesn't mean that's most of what we believe. So I think what I would say is, in terms of like climate change, yeah, as we learn more, or think we do, the world we think we live in changes. But we'll always have to keep an open mind that the world we think we live in is not is not true in certain respects.
Sorry to push a little bit further, Doug, but I get the point about Donald Trump, right? There's a ontological fact that something happens in a particular voting point, right? That happens out there. But with a landscape, it's not just that the landscape changes independently. The landscape itself, because there's a different kind of science, the way that biology works, that itself is shaped in the way that people are impacting it. So maybe I just feel a slight disconcertedness when it says it's independent. And I'm like, well, it's kind of not independent.
We have to go beyond Bhaskar here to Margaret Archer and what she calls the morphogenetic approach, which really I think is just a Marxian principle that people make their own history, but not under circumstances of their own making. So you take a landscape, people form ideas about that landscape, they act on those ideas, they change the landscape. So as you say, yeah, there's a historical dialect. There is a historical dialectic that's not very highfalutin. It's just a temporal interaction between people and their environment. And that's an ongoing, so I think you just have to untangle that by talking about different time periods, which is what Archer tries to do. And she elaborates this morphogenetic model.
I think, if I may, I think it's a very important point, because critical realism started as a reflection on the philosophy of the natural sciences. And what was he basically saying? It's a simple idea. It's kind of turning back, if you want, the Copernican revolution of Kant. It's basically saying there is a world out there. This world existed before humans came on the scene, and this world is going to continue to exist once the humans exit as well. This world can only be known by us humans through our different theories. Our different theories try to capture this world, but of course it does not mean that if you change your theory, that the world is changing as well. Actually, you have to presuppose that this world exists, that there are different theories that try to capture it, and this distinction between different epistemologies, if you want, and one ontology which you have to presuppose, that is basically a very strong intuition of Bhaskar. Of course, when you move through the social sciences, I mean, then it becomes completely different. And there, in fact, I myself think that the naturalism is slightly problematical. And I would like to say that what we have with the ontology of the social world is precisely that everything is made, nothing is given, even God is a social construction. So this distinction between the ontological and the epistemological, or if you want, between the transitive dimension and the intransitive dimension of knowledge, as Bhaskar called it, it just breaks down. Because precisely, I mean, our conceptions of reality are constitutive of reality, not completely. I mean, it's not that, you know, if we just start thinking in a different way, tomorrow that the war will be over and everything will be fine. No, but everything that is social, I mean, is basically a social construction or a social destruction. So that's where the two dimensions, in fact, they overlap. And that's where I, instead of doing critical naturalism, I actually want to do critical hermeneutics. But about the ontology of the natural world, I only oblige to natural scientists. So when they tell me that the COVID virus does exist and that it functions in this way, I mean, then I really think, yes, I mean, that's what I just oblige to them. And I believe indeed that there's something like a natural substrate, even if, you know, it's, how would I say, I don't think it's a human construction, but that's, even that is contested nowadays. Sure.
Any questions? I think we have time to take one question or two very short ones.
Well, let me just say something to what Frederic was saying. So I too would say the social is all socially constructed. That's true. There I would say you have to make a distinction between what the observer is saying and what's been constructed by what the observer is observing. But constructed by the actors, the observer is observing.
We have a question by Justin, who's interested in knowing what is the first reading that he should have a look at if you want to know more about critical realism. Of course, the two books that you wrote, I imagine, but apart from that.
Yeah, apart from our books, probably the realist theory of science, which is accessible.
Mm-hmm. I would recommend Reclaiming Reality, which is a collection of essays, because a realist theory of science is it's pretty difficult. Whereas I think Reclaiming Reality is a little bit more accessible.
That may be true.
I'll actually jump in quickly because I know David Graeber really liked this idea of these encompassing spheres, you know, the fact that biology is encompassed by physics, etc. And this idea that Bhaskar had, that on these different spheres, you had different levels of freedom. So you could argue that a human being is a bit less free than a bird, and an atom is a bit less free than a bird, and so on. But then it looks a little bit like a panpsychism. What do you think about that? Do you guys have an opinions on that?
So the so-called new materialists discovering things, not reading anything that critical realists have said for the last 3 decades, have in fact embraced vitalism, which is a kind of a panpsychic approach. We would approach it differently and just say things have causal powers. They're not the same as our causal powers, but you know, you have to make a distinction between how the causal powers a human has and the causal power that a volcano has. But everything has got causal powers. And the other thing that makes critical realism different from the post-structuralist approaches, now Deleuze is the new Foucault, and everybody cites Deleuze, and everything is gooey, flowing assemblages. Critical realists believe in emergence, that there are levels of reality, and the logics of the causal logics are different at different levels of reality. So atoms, you know, elementary particles behave according to a quantum logic that macro objects just don't. And there's all kinds of levels in between.
Well, this question of animism and vitalism and multinaturalism and so on, I actually think that the debate has shifted a little bit. I mean, I don't think that we can argue one the way we would argue 20 years ago. And I think this has to do with globalization. This has to do with post-colonialism. And what you actually have is actually that different visions of the world beyond the naturalistic Western vision, I mean, have also something to teach us. We can learn from them. I don't think that Bhaskar would be against that. I think that Bhaskar would very much agree. As a standard critical realist, and that is also the argument that David defended in his paper against Viveros, Castros, and Latour and Descolaya, which would basically be saying, yes, of course, they live in different worlds, live world. They have different visions. But in fact, when you look at the natural world, I mean, science is getting to real things. I mean, even indigenous populations, they don't fly in the air, even if they think, I mean, that raw spirits and even that raw animals are flying in the air. I mean, there's something like something which is real, and that, of course, is not contested. But what you have with critical realism, and certainly I think in its first classical version, is that it very much focuses on science. But the scientific view of reality, of nature, is only one view of nature. When you go walking in nature, when you go walking on the beach, or when you read poetry, I mean, you also have access to nature one way or another. Is it the same nature? Yes, it is, and no, it isn't. So I think that once you dislocate, in fact, this emphasis on science and on scientific experiments and so on, I mean, then there's another side that comes up, and I think there, in fact, and certainly the last Bhaskar would agree with that. There's something to be learned from those other approaches to nature, and then the question is how, once you accept that, where do you take the give and take? And I think that David's paper on this point was quite interesting, because indeed, when you're an anthropologist, I mean, then indeed you're used to different visions of the world, different live worlds. There's a footnote in this text where David says, well, you know, when anthropologists to speak about the ontology, what they mean by ontology is phenomenology. I think that's spot on. And I mean, I don't have any problem by saying that, you know, different people live in different worlds. That does not, how would I say, that is not a denial that there's a common world which are certain structures. But yes, I mean, that's exactly what we do in the human sciences. We study live worlds, we study how people experience. So I would say this dislocation from experiments to experiences is something which I think probably know also that the sides have shifted, and that the struggles are not the same, the wars are not the same, the philosophical and scientific and political positions have changed. So I'm not sure I would like to push a really orthodox view here, but I mean, it can be done and it should be done, but at the same time there's always changes and exchanges of perspectives and common learning.
Well, thank you so much, Frederic and Douglas. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I saw many new faces, and that's always really nice. The attendance was actually quite high tonight, so that's really good. The next session will be about Whitehead, which is also on the list, and we're gonna have Stephen Shaviro, and it's going to be on the 21st of April. So you guys can put that in your agenda already. I put the link to the event in the chat. Thank you very much, Frederic and Douglas, for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.